can't hear me perfectly loud and clear, please wave to me, right? And when I say wave, and I'll try and up the volume. But I imagine it's about right now. Everybody can hear me pretty clearly. Right. You can see this is the first of 2 lectures I'm giving for this course, both on continuous speech, what happens and the differences that occur when speakers are saying numbers of words one after another in the form of sentences and so on, as opposed to what words are like when they're uttered in isolation. And this first lecture is on reductions to the articulation of words. Now, this is a very important topic, in my view, because a very characteristic thing about the English language is that people hurry over things that are unimportant to them, and they group together quite closely, but say quite quickly the things they consider less important. So there's a problem, often of being understood, if you don't do the same thing as the native speaker does in this respect. So, this is what I've just said then. Weight to important syllables, neglect of the unimportant. And the upshot of this, the result of this preference, is that some words actually change their form. Now, we identify a word as consisting of a certain set of phonemes. And what happens is very often the phoneme set changes when we pronounce these words differently according to our needs. And what our needs we see are, there's a need to make clear what we mean by grouping together words that belong together grammatically and separating more words that don't belong with other groups. So now there are 4 principal ways in which we do this, the things we do to words, how we change the normal form of the word. If you regard the form you find in the dictionary and say it in isolation, if you regard that in its normal form, then we subject the word to one of 4 main processes. The first one we call it assimilation, which will involve also a particular type of assimilation we call coalescence, and then the other 3 are elision, that's omission of the sound, compression, that's turning what would be 2 syllables into 1, and liaison, which is linking. So, as I say here, we change phonemes under what I call rhythmic pressure. You exert a pressure to unite words into a group because you think they belong together. And this is a very important part of your signaling. You're signaling your message to people when you're talking English. And if you don't make the kind of signaling processes that we normally use in speaking English, then you'll be less comfortable to listen to, you may be less comprehensible even. So, what I call it, this process is rhythmic integration. Rhythmically integrating groups of words which are unified grammatical entities, I put it here very beautifully, yes. Now the first one is assimilation. And this is, well, I've got very good news to you about this one. This is in many ways the least important of these phenomena because practically all assimilations that we make in English are optional. Optional in the sense they're at the speaker's will. He can either make them or not as he feels necessary. And of course, what people do in speaking is they don't decide, oh, I shall assimilate this word, but I won't the next sort of thing. No, they do it quite subconsciously, but habitually. And they don't do it with total regularity. So, in fact, then you can be totally relaxed about what happens in assimilation. And there are 2 kinds of assimilation, by the way. There's the anticipating assimilation that starts to put the speech organs in the position for the next sound before you come to it. And there's the reverse of that. But anyway, there are very few cases of assimilation that you will sound wrong if you fail to use them. The ones I've drawn your attention to here are a couple of examples at the bottom line here. We change the S to esh, and we change the Z to je in things like bus shelter and is she, for instance. Now, you can say, of course, bus shelter, or is she. But if you do, you cut the speed of what you're saying by half at least, and that doesn't do, because if you keep on trying to get the pure form of the word bus in bus shelter, then you're going to have that kind of thing happening all the time, and it'll reduce your clarity of speech, because it'll sound as if it's oddly slowed down to the listener. So the point is, you must aim, and the most important thing in speech is not to bore or tire or worry your listener, and you want to be adequately fluent. You want to go at the sort of speed that is normal and natural, and that facilitates understanding. People can understand you better if you're going at a normal speed. So there's a warning here not to slow down artificially, but to keep things going smoothly as you need to, and make any breaks in the flow of speech where they are necessary to signal some fact, a grammatical matter and so on. And I'll give another example here of something you can avoid doing. Don't try and say cruise ship instead of cruise ship. Don't say horseshoe instead of horseshoe. And what happens is we were coming on in a moment to this other kind of development, other kind of procedure we have, and it's omitting a sound altogether. And very commonly, there's a second stage in this assimilation thing, and a word like horseshoe, for instance, will become horseshoe. And that esh that you had made out of the S that ended the word horse, for the moment you're saying horseshoe, you're pronouncing what corresponds to the letter S in the spelling of the word horse, you're pronouncing it as a sh, horse. But of course you wouldn't ever say horse when you're not going to have that pattern, unless of course you're very drunk. So be careful not to overdo it to attempt those things. Now, there's one very minor feature of coalescence, and there's good news about this too. You could, once I've mentioned it to you, for you to have a complete idea of what things that are possible to go on, you can then forget it, but you don't need to do it yourselves. But we very often say, make a T or D coalesce, join together with the following yod, and a typical expression we use is did you. Did you understand that? Did you? Which is not did you, of course. That's very commonplace, but if you aim at did you, and you get it like that, and there's no frication, no fricative sound introduced, then that's perfectly normal too. It's optional to do those. So I would promptly forget them if I were you. And another thing that represents coalescence is that we have a sort of swing of the pendulum in the development of English. So some generations affect to despise speakers who do certain things that they consider to be lazy speaking or something like that. Usually the people who have these ideas, we call them purists very often. People who have these ideas that are a bit silly. They haven't thought carefully enough about what's happening. But anyway, you will find that today, increasingly, in the current swing of the pendulum, people pronounce the word Tuesday quite often as Tuesday, and they pronounce the word Jew as Jew and so on. But again, you don't need to imitate that at all. You can aim for what the spelling suggests is right, and it will always sound okay, right? It hasn't gone so far that everybody does it. As a matter of fact, most people not speaking fairly casually don't do it. So, there you are, as I said, the warning you, to be a purist and despise this sort of thing is a bit old-fashioned. So you're not advised to adopt these. Now, there's an exception here, a very important exception, because it sounds completely wrong to me if a person wants to use the expression used to, and that verb used to, in this sense, means was accustomed to. I used to go to that pub sort of thing, used to. And what happens there is you regularly change the S, the Z of the verb use, because in all other situations the verb use is pronounced with a Z. You know, use and use is a pair of words where the spelling is the same, but use with a Z is the verb and use with an S is the noun. People often get that pattern wrong. And there are several other words like that too, like close and close and so on. So you want to watch those S letters. They can vary a good deal, but you always should, I think, say used to and not used to when you mean was accustomed. I'll give you a sentence if you like. We could say of quills, that's the feathers of birds, quills used to be used to write with. Used to be used to write with. Now, used to be were at one time a customary, right? And used to write with, there's a sort of break between used and to write with. There's a grammatical separation there, and nobody would assimilate that sequence of used and to into used to. Used to then is one to take notice of. And there are a few others like that you'll come across. I noticed with interest that in his dictionary, Professor Wells recommends, if you like to put it there, he gives first, as the pronunciation of supposed to, a similar one. Not supposed to, but supposed to. And I'm sure he's absolutely right about the frequency of occurrence. Most people say supposed to, just the same as they say used to. But a lot of people still say supposed to. And so if you don't try to do that, you'll be perfectly all right, doing the regular thing. And there are one or two other phrases on this page here. Like a lot of people, a lot of the time, say have to instead of have to. Or they say of course instead of course. But you needn't bother to imitate those things. If you find yourself doing it naturally, or you prefer it that way, then well and good. It's very common, very ordinary, won't bother anybody. So, but there's no need to go out of your way to do that, and the same goes for has to instead of has to. Personally, I vary in those, and I think I usually say the more ordinary form. I'd say has to rather than has to as a rule. But I never quite know. Most people don't know what they say, really. You know, I often have listened to myself, what I said a moment ago, and I'm quite surprised that I say it that way. I find new things like that almost every day. But it doesn't matter. Right, now, we're on assimilations, and I'm going to warn you about certain assimilations. Now, very likely you personally don't tend to do these, but they're an important thing to warn people against who have the tendency to do it. And it covers quite a large number of people: Dutch people, French, Greek, people who speak the Slavonic languages, and a number of African languages, and they say things like this. Instead of saying back door, they say bag door. Instead of saying baseball, they say baseball. Now, I've written them out so you can see them in the false spelling, if you like. But this is what the listener, the native-speaking listener particularly, hears when he hears baseball. He pictures baize, which is some green cloth you put on billiard tables and things like that. And if you don't say bus route, avoiding this assimilation, then you get buzz route. And instead of iceberg, you get iceberg. Instead of juice bottle, you get Jew's bottle. Very strange. Instead of wristwatch, you get wristwatch. Whatever a riz is, I don't know. But watchman becomes watchman. Rope ladder becomes rope ladder. And roast beef becomes rose beef. Very, very strange. And worst of all, on horse becomes on horse. If you know what the word ball means, you know that's not a very good association to be suggesting falsely. Okay? It means a very naughty woman. Now that's what I call, what did I call them? French style. French style. But there's another kind that I call Yorkshire. Well, everybody calls Yorkshire style assimilation. If you're looking in this great 3-volume work of Professor Wells called Accents of English, you'll find he has quite a little bit about this Yorkshire style. And I live in the midst of this. I've lived for the last 35, 40 years in Yorkshire, and near Leeds, where I was on the staff of the university, the Department of Linguistics and Phonetics, and I hear it every day in friends and colleagues and so on. It's a natural thing to do for them, but it's not natural for anybody else in the whole of the English-speaking world. All the millions and millions of speakers who speak standard English in below the equator, in South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the whole of America. No one does this except Yorkshire folk, right? So you don't want to be labelled a Yorkshireman if you haven't got a reason for it. So I would avoid this. Anyway, here it is. They say dreadful instead of dreadful, and they say fock patches instead of fog patches, and they say yes, flagpoles instead of flagpoles, that type of thing. So there are some very fine speakers who just give away their Yorkshire. Well, they give it away in other respects too, but I remember the great author who was very popular at one time called J.B. Priestley, who wrote a lot of plays and various books, probably the most famous of all Yorkshire writers. Well, when you heard him talking on the radio, because he wasn't on television very much, he died quite some time ago, he would tend to say Bradford instead of Bradford, which is what most Bradford folk do say. But the normal educated pronunciation of that word is Bradford. So on no account imitate it. Because you might sound funny and you'll probably be understood, but it's better not to sound funny, isn't it? Right. So, yes, well, there are various other sporadic assimilations people make, and they will depend on your own language, really, how it affects you. But one I've noticed very often, and one always sounds awful to me, really, is when I offer somebody a drink and they say, I'd love one. Well, obviously, you know, they've let the V at the end of love contaminate the W at the beginning of one. Because the word spelled O-N-E, one of the nastiest spellings in the English language, isn't it? It begins with a vowel letter, but the spoken form begins with a vowel sound. And, sorry, with a W. So not I love them then, if you can avoid that. Now, that's assimilation. Our second topic is elision, and very good news once again, really. Most elisions you don't have to worry about. But you'll find that there are some where there are particularly large groups of consonants, 2 or 3 consonants coming in succession that nobody finds easy to say. And of course, if you try and say them, if you actually try to say breast stroke, or first stop, or masked ball, or next time, you sound ridiculous. You're being over careful, and you really may even be mistaken for intending to say something different. So people do simplify these. As a matter of fact, one of the curious things which has not got into any of the dictionaries or the grammar books yet, but it's happening wholesale at the moment. It's been a fact of life in spoken English for 30 years at least. And that is that practically everybody today doesn't say the final S in a word like costs. I have to slow down and be careful to say that. And certainly you never hear it of another that follows immediately, but nowadays you don't hear it whatever follows. If the word costs is spoken in isolation, most often, most speakers will not say that final S. Now, they used not to do that 50, 60 years ago. I know because I was around then. They used not to do that. They started doing it for the typical motive of people who change their speech. They wanted to sound better, and they thought, you see, 50, 60 years ago, people used to pronounce the word costs. I'm using the artificial pronunciation now, so you know I'm saying the S, the T, and the S. They used to pronounce costs as costs. Now, that was just making a double S or a long S, costs. And then people noticed that the T was being left out, so they thought to themselves, subconsciously, but we must put that T back in. It's naughty to leave out a T if it's there in the spelling. So they put it back in. But the effort was so great that they couldn't manage to say the final S then. It was too much trouble. And so they go on. And now we've got a whole set of words. In grammar books, they'll have a short group of words, like sheep, for instance, which are the same in the singular and the plural. But the plural of cost or post or whatever it is also the same as the singular these days, for most people. Now, again, you probably find it easier to do that than not to do it, because it demands a big effort if you say the STS at the end of a word, all of it. So, one or two other items of this sort. We very often drop, I'll give you some examples here. The expressions I've given are the wrong spellings of them. but they do represent exactly how we say them. And they're good deal, take care, Prime Minister, and extra attention, for instance. For what, if you slow down and say it correctly, is good deal, take care, Prime Minister, and extra attention. But in fact, most people haven't got the time to say those properly, if you want to put it that way, and they tend to make that sort of adjustment. Now, in your case, I say it's good news, you don't need to bother to follow that pattern. But you should be ready to receive it, you should be ready to understand it when you hear it. Another place where the language has been changing in the last 40 or 50 years, people used to say things like actually, generally, obviously, usually, but now those are very unusual pronunciations. Unfortunately, the pronouncing dictionaries are very slow and hesitant about catching up with things. They don't like to anticipate new developments. But it sounds completely old-fashioned and wrong to me to say usually. Usually. 4 syllables. No, they're not 4 syllables these days. They're usually 2 or 3 syllables. And usually, for instance, in a very common pronunciation, that's just 2. Usually is 3. But usually is, it just isn't normal. I mean, it sounds like you just dug it out of the ground from several million years ago. Okay. So, and another kind of thing too is people used to say, or tried to say, temporarily. And I can almost remember the last time I heard that. I had to rush and make a note of who it was that said it, because it's so unusual, right? People in the last 40 years have given up saying temporarily, and they've taken 1 of 2 routes to make it easier. They either say temporarily, which is very common indeed. I've heard it this week from announced on the radio, temporarily, and then of course it coincides with the adverb formed on the adjective temporal. Now I don't know whether you know the adjective temporal. It's not a very common word in English, but it's the word used to distinguish between the ecclesiastical or religious, if you like, use of ideas and so on, and the ordinary everyday use. So I was very amused once when I heard on the radio an announcement that a parson, a vicar in the south of England, had been, he had an improper relationship with one of his lady parishioners, and they suspended him from his job, and then they said temporarily. Well, of course it was quite true. He'd become temporal when he had been sacred before, or holy, but that's just a little accident that occurs. Everybody's perfectly happy to pronounce the word formally, temporarily, as temporary. And if you go back to the old pronunciation, you'll sound like some ancient old fogey like Daniel Jones, for instance, who would always manage to say those like that. And I said there's another route they have of simplifying that matter. They can do what Americans do and say temporarily. And that happens with words like primarily and becoming primarily and so on. Another one I just heard in the last 24 hours. Right. So one more thing about these then. When you have an English word ending in a plosive consonant and another word following, it doesn't begin with a vowel, but begins another consonant, then the habitual thing to do is not to release the first consonant. So you don't say outtake, but outtake, and so on. And now, I've given several examples here which are not pronounced take care, or postman, or windmill, or grandfather. I occasionally hear some rather self-conscious speaker trying to do this. They sound silly if they do, right? Occasionally some people will try it, thinking they're speaking better than everybody else. But of course, the chap who thinks he's speaking better than everybody else is like the soldier who thinks he's the only one in step, right? All the others are starting off on the wrong foot, and he's the right one, but there you are. So there's another little warning then, not to overdo that sort of thing. And another warning again, and I've just set to my class in pronunciation, I set them a passage to transcribe. And they've done it very nicely, most of them, except when they came to the word Christmas, they noticed there was a T in it, and they kept it in their transcription. but people haven't pronounced the T in Christmas for about 1,000 years, right? I wouldn't put the clock back that far. Christmas has never had a T heard. No. I mean, I don't say I've never heard anybody say it. I have. I've heard somebody try to say Christmas, and when they did, they sounded quite ridiculous. So, and there are various other words like that that are misleading. Blackguard is one, not a very common word perhaps. And there's cupboard. Cupboard, of course, is a very common word, and it hasn't been pronounced cupboard or something like that since the time of King Alfred, 1,000 years ago. So I wouldn't go reviving that one either. And even less noticeably, the word evening. It's amazing how many people think because it has 3 syllables in spelling, evening, that they're going to say 3 syllables. But it's practically non-existent amongst natural speakers of English. To say good evening, you immediately give yourself away as not a native speaker of English. Good evening, evening, just 2 syllables, eve and me. And the same goes for a number of words like general and several, is the example I've given you here. Soften too, and I noticed that they rather got crossed with each other, the words soften and often at the bottom there. Soften is, you don't pronounce the T in that. The T has disappeared years ago. And at one time, until the late 19th century, the word often was only pronounced often. Now, I often pronounce it often. But I also often pronounce it often. Often pronounce it often. You know, I mean, I can't make up my mind which I'm going to use. I'm perhaps influenced by the last person I heard say it. But that word has given in to the tendency of people who wish we all spoke as the spelling suggests. But we don't. And so don't try and put the T back into the word soften or any other word of that sort, except the word often. You can make your own decision about that. An interesting date matter of this, the word often was given in dictionaries in the 19th century as only often. And then in 1911, the famous Fowler brothers, I don't know if you've ever heard of them, they were famous at the time, they wrote books on pure English and things like that. And anyway, they produced a new dictionary. A dictionary that's sold in huge numbers ever since, called the Concise Oxford Dictionary. And it was made into a single volume by boiling down the numerous volumes of the Great Oxford Dictionary, right? As far as it had got then, anyway. So in 1911 they issued it, and they made a comment. They showed the pronunciation as often, and then they added often, also often, but to be, well, I've forgotten the exact word, but to be discouraged. They disapproved of it. They thought it was upstart, people who fussed too much about language were saying it. So at that time it was fussy, it was not a good thing to do, but now it's completely normal. You've got your choice. Another sequence that you have to be careful of too is people often don't notice that although we run so many other things in together, when we have an affricate, ch or j, ending one word, and an affricate or beginning a word and having an affricate before it, ending one word, beginning the next, then we release that first one. We don't let it be swallowed. We don't say, look, you see my examples here, village church or H.G. Wells, right? Notice I've chosen spellings that reflect how they're said, even if they're not correct, if you like. And what chain, but we say village church, village church. We're willing to take the trouble to say village church and release that j at the end of village. And H.G. Wells and watch chain. I find those are difficult to say, relatively speaking, and some EFL students seem to find them very difficult because they don't manage to do it. They run them in together, but it doesn't sound right in English. So, be careful of those. If there's only one affricate involved, it doesn't matter. For instance, there's the word Cambridgeshire, I'll give it as an example. Now, Cambridgeshire, I can think of saying it the first way I've transcribed here, Cambridgeshire, or with a j, Cambridgeshire. I can't feel I'm doing anything different, I can't hear anything different when I say those. They sound the same to me. So there you are. Further simplification. Now, you see, we make various simplifications, mainly by elision, when we're speaking ourselves. But there are ones that EFL users often make that we don't make, that we don't think are authorized simplifications. And a good example of that is that people have trouble with the plural of the word month. The word month has a plural of months, but in fact most of us don't pronounce it that way. What we do is we make it easier by dropping the th, and instead of saying months, we say months, months ago, right? Well, some people think that that's rather lazy way of saying it, but it's what people normally do. And what I do find is some EFL students want to say, simplify it, but keep the th and lose the final s. Now that's no good, but you can't say 6 months ago. That sounds terrible. In fact, it sounds like dialect. People, in the 19th century, we still had a lot of survival of the old rural dialects that had existed for hundreds of years and were very different from standard English. And a lot of those would not have a plural with an S on such a word, in many phrases at least. But you can't do that in modern English. It isn't standard English to do that. You have to say either months and go the whole hog and get the S out, or, as I say, use my easy way of saying it, months. There are also quite some problems saying fifths, sixths, and twelfths. And it's interesting to look in the LPD again, Professor Wells' dictionary. He's a little bit doubtful about one or two of these. He even labels twelfths as casual, for instance. Twelfths, I didn't say the F. But people often use that pronunciation, call it casual or not. And what they do is something very hard for you to attempt, I think, when they say fifths and sixths. And I'm exaggerating the clarity. They say fifths, sixths, that's more normal, right? Now what I've done is really blended the th and the th into a single articulation, the same act of uttering a consonant. But that's difficult. So probably you ought to aim to say it in the way that keeps each sound in fifths and sixths. But of course it will force you to slow down a bit. And perhaps sometimes it forces you to slow down too much. So you have a fairly difficult decision to make there. And I've already mentioned, haven't I, at the end, that STS ending a word is usually reduced to ST in plurals and things. Plurals, and that is third forms of verbs. Now, we've done with assimilation and elision, and seen some examples of the danger words, and found on the whole that they're relatively easy. And here we have something also very easy because you don't have to worry about it on the whole. You can say radius, radius, 3 syllables, or radius, 2 syllables, radius, radius. And there are hundreds and hundreds of words that have this kind of sequence, which you can treat in that way. Another example I've given here is you can say following, following, or you can say following, following, following. And both sound perfectly okay, so you have your choice, and obviously the easy thing is not to bother to even think about this topic. But what I have mentioned here is that there are certain situations in which if you don't remember to make a compression, and a compression is the chief use of the word compression, which I had the pleasure of introducing into phonetic literature. I first invented that word to describe this phenomenon in 1969 in a textbook of mine, and I'm very flattered to see that Professor Wells thought it was a good one because he took it up and used it very widely. But anyway, compression is essentially, chiefly, the compressing into one syllable of what was previously 2 syllables. So you change what was a vowel into a consonant. In other words, you change the E vowel, as in radius, for instance, into the corresponding consonant, semivowel, yeah, radius. Change an E into a ya. But here's the one kind of example which I would think is probably best for you to try to, if you're aiming high, you know, at a good, smooth kind of English that really is very acceptable to everybody and doesn't make people suddenly notice that you are not speaking English in the most ordinary sort of way, but doing something rather different from other people. If you think of the words, I'll give the examples, fireman and powerful, right? Now, if I say fire, that's fine, right? I don't have to say fire. Some people say fire, but I wouldn't recommend you do that. Fire is clear, has 2 syllables, fire. But if I take the word fireman, now I don't say fireman, as I don't say powerful, right? If I say them like that, it sounds as if I'm treading very carefully, and I'm anxious not to get them wrong, or something of that sort. What I do is I compress, smooth out a bit that sequence. So I practically lose the I in fireman, and I practically lose the U in powerful. Not our, but powerful, fireman. Those smoother pronunciations are the normal ones. And the dictionaries don't really help you a lot with this, although I think the LPD probably puts such a vowel in italic type, which is a guide to you too, that you can leave it out, and also a hint perhaps that people usually do leave it out. So that's the way to deal with those things. Power station again. If it's a compound like that and there's another thing following it immediately, and they're a unit, then you rather reduce the articulation, you compress the articulation, hour, which some people call a triphthong, but it's got 3 vowel letters needed to transcribe it. You compress it to a single syllable. And of course a triphthong, a real triphthong would be at least 2 syllables. Other examples given here, Empire and Russia. I particularly like the example Russia, right? Because very often when I have students speaking to me about what used to be called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they would refer to Russia. Where do you come from? I come from Russia. The trouble there is that there is a word Russia in English, right? But it isn't that country, right? Russia is a typical, very common way of pronouncing this word, rush hour, because nobody says, oh, I got caught in a traffic jam in the rush hour. Oh, no. Hour, fine. You make it strong, but if you're going to put it together with rush and have a compound word like that, when it's an unstressed section of that word, rush hour, you can make it a diphthong if you like, or even smooth it out to rush hour. And then you've got only the R vowel there, not even our diphthong of any sort. But yeah, don't make too much of that. Don't say rush hour, and don't say empire. Pyre is fine. You know the word pyre, but a funeral pyre, for instance, where you burn somebody's bodies. But empire, no. If it's that neglectable, so that you don't do that sort of thing with it. Okay, I must get on. Liaison is our last topic, and there's a simple rule about this, and it's if you've got a word ending in English with the spelling R at the end of the word, or the spelling RE equally, because the E doesn't count for much, and this word ends with R or a schwa, and you notice R or an I put in there as phonemic units, but I have enclosed the schwa in brackets, because that means it's the sound schwa, not just the phoneme schwa. And the sound schwa, this enables me to make this rule very short, but the sound schwa occurs at the end of various other sequences. For instance, the diphthongs ear, and all end in the schwa sound. So they come into this generalization too. But anyway, if a word with letter R in the spelling ends with schwa or one of those 3 other vowels I mentioned, they are rather open vowels. The high, close vowels are not amongst them. If it ends like that, then when another word follows, which begins with a vowel, the normal thing to do. Thank you. I've got 3 minutes to go. the normal thing to do is to carry that R on. Well, actually what is happening is we've never not had it, right? We've dropped them in the places where it's more awkward to say them, but here we feel it helps almost to link to the following word. And we call that linking R. And it's universal to do that. And I'll give you in a moment some phrases where you really shouldn't leave it out. But now I'm not going to talk today about the so-called intrusive R, because people are so used to using this schwa ending words that it have an R in the spelling, that they do it whether they've got an R in the spelling or not. And practically everybody who's a native English speaker of the kind that you're studying will say the idea of it. Right? Now there isn't any R in the spelling, I know, but we're so used to having the schwa ending and doing it that we do it with that. Now, here's a little warning, my last warning to you, and that is that you will sound quite abnormal in your British English, if you like, if you don't cultivate making this R link when you've got two words very closely grammatically connected, and one ends in R and the other begins with a R. And I've given some examples of this. Our own, or else, better and better, later on, far off, other end. If you say our own, or else, or better and better, later on, far off, other end, you sound very strange to me. The only people who have done that, it used to be a fashion in the early 30s amongst rather precious people at Oxford or Cambridge, right? And some elderly ones still do it. If you know the voice of the poet Stephen Spender, he could do that kind of thing. But most people have dropped doing that as sounding too precious thing to do. And of course, what you will find that are purists are people who want to tell others how to speak, and they castigate, they grumble at people who don't make the R link, or do make the R links when there isn't an R in the spelling. But they are talking nonsense, because it's perfectly natural to make that linking. And such people as that, they talk about, they say, this person is not saying law and order, as they want to say it, but they're saying law and order, right? Laura and order sounds like a girl's name, right? Miss Lauder, whose first name is Laura. Or other people make jokes about it and say, you know, we're fond of creating book names and give funny titles to the authors that has a pun, a joke on the book name. And this famous one is Dog's Delight by Nora Bone. Nora is a common first name for women, but Nora Bone, of course, is representing Gnor, the G isn't pronounced in Gnor, as you know that, the thing to bite at with your teeth. And some people object to things like I saw it, and drawing even with an R in the middle put in, but we're so used to putting those R's in other situations that we tend easily to drop into putting them where they traditionally didn't belong. And so you'll get a division of opinion. Some people would strongly disapprove of this development, but take no notice of them. If you want to do it, put the R in. On the other hand, if you don't have a tendency to do it, I imagine from your knowledge of spelling you will want to do it, then don't bother at all. Forget all about it. Right, that's it. Thank you very much.